This is episode 110 of the Death to Tyrants podcast.
The crushing weight of the tyrant's passage had left nothing unmarked.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquids, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
What is up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Death to Tyrants podcast. As always, I am your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson. And before we get to the guest today, welcome to all of the new people. And I know there's a lot of you because I've had the downloads go crazy, the influx of messages in my email box, the followers on Twitter, the subscribers on the YouTube channel, all of that jumped up crazy. And if you're new to this podcast, you know why. You heard it on Dave Smith's Part of the Problem podcast. So I can tell you one thing, advertising on Dave Smith's podcast works quite well, as it should. He is the top of the game here. He's the best at what we do. So welcome, you guys. Feel free to hit the subscribe button on iTunes, leave a review on iTunes, all of that good stuff. I'm so stoked to have a bunch of new listeners. So today, I finally get to talk with Daniel McCarthy. I've wanted to chat with him for quite some time. If you've heard him on other podcasts, you know how brilliant he is. And what a cool guy. We're going to talk about the Neocons. He wrote a good article recently called Neocons Come Home to Roost. And it touches upon a point I've made many times on this show, is that the left has pulled the neocons back in and welcomed them. They're back home where they came from. And we can forget about calling the left the anti-war party, the Democratic Party, the anti-war party, the left, the anti-war side of the aisle, if you will. Although we've got some good friends, it's funny, they're on the far left. We might disagree on economics quite a bit, but we often agree that being anti-war is first and foremost huge. It's the most important political topic, really, is war. But the modern Democratic Party has certainly welcomed the neocon warmongers back into their fold to push establishment orthodoxy and all of the terrible things that they've pushed upon the world, unfortunately, over the last several decades. And so we're going to talk a lot about that. We get into Trumpism, libertarianism, modern conservative movement, the paleo-conservative movement, and then, of course, the awful neocon movement. And we kind of get into all of that. And Daniel McCarthy is so wise on this stuff. Daniel McCarthy is the director of the Robert Novak Journalism Fellowship Program at the Fund for American Studies, and he is editor of Modern Age, a conservative review. So glad to have you here, Daniel. Welcome to the show.
I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah, you wrote an article. You write a lot of them, and I always love them. One of the most recent pieces I read is one that it's a point I've been making on this podcast for quite some time, that the neocons have returned home to roost, kind of where they started in the Democratic side of the aisle, we'll say. Before we get into the weeds on this issue, I think it will help to lay some groundwork, just in case at this point I still have listeners that are thinking, what do they mean when they keep saying neocon and neoconservative? What does that term mean to you?
Well, back in the 1960s, there were a number of Cold War Democrats, people who were basically New Deal liberals, who became very unhappy with the direction of the Democratic Party. They saw the rise of the anti-war movement, for example, as something that went against their Cold War hawkishness. They also were troubled by, as a lot of Americans were, by the sort of violence in the streets with protests and other things. And so the neoconservative movement basically began with a rejection of George McGovern and the direction that the Democratic Party was taking under McGovern in 1972. And these basically New Deal and even Great Society Democrats left the Democratic Party. They started to become, or at least talk in a more conservative way. And then they started to join the Republican Party. And very soon after they joined the Republicans, they started basically trying to call the shots and to kick out people who had been conservatives for a very long time, and to say, you know what, we newcomers, we know how to elect Republicans, we know how to get conservative ideas across better than you old guard conservatives or Republicans do.
Yeah, with that's kind of what Paul Gottfried gets into quite a bit is the purge. Is that what you're kind of referencing there when you say they were kind of kicking some of these old guard out of the movement?
It basically is. In the Reagan administration, for example, President Reagan put in his administration a number of old guard conservatives, but also a number of neoconservatives. And it turned out that the neoconservatives were much more effective at playing internal politics. And they maneuvered to get, some of the paleoconservatives or old guard conservatives marginalized. And so you had the rise of people like William Bennett, for example, who was a neoconservative ally. You had the rise of someone like William Kristol, who eventually becomes, in the George H.W. Bush administration, he is Vice President Dan Quayle's chief of staff. Later on, he founds the Weekly Standard, and now he's, big neocon spokesman on Twitter. Later on, you get neoconservatives like David Frum working as speechwriters for George W. Bush in the 2000s. So they were a very influential part of the conservative movement and the Republican Party between the Reagan administration and the George W. Bush administration. And in some ways, they were seen as being responsible for much of the foreign policy of the George W. Bush administration. They were big-time supporters of the Iraq War. And because that project turned out so badly, they've been discredited ever since.
Is there something you would say that their philosophy's rooted in? Because you touched upon it there a bit. I always think of them as kind of war hawks, basically, and obsessed with the military-industrial complex and always pushing interventionist foreign policy. Is there something you would say like, yes, the neocons' philosophy is rooted in XYZ?
Well, it's partly rooted in their original New Deal liberalism. And so that's why you see a lot of neoconservatives right now becoming virulently anti-Trump. They don't like the idea that Trump is shaking up the administrative state. They don't like the idea that Trump is not listening to the intelligence community. The neoconservatives are really big defenders of the kind of bureaucratic administrative apparatus. They want to, sort of reform it a little bit, but they basically want to keep it in place. They want to maintain its prestige and its power. Sometimes they've been called big government conservatives, and that's generally pretty much true. They claim to be conservative on social issues, but in fact, when these things are put to the test, they always put a hawkish foreign policy above any kind of commitment to social issues. They put their hatred of Donald Trump above their commitment to social issues as well. And in foreign policy, they have a paranoid outlook. They have this, incessant threat inflation. They always believe that if the United States is not actively waging war against someone, that we are therefore about to get attacked, or that we're kind of losing prestige around the world in terms of power, and that we're basically getting weaker by the moment if we're not actively engaging in a war with anyone and everyone.
Yeah, you mentioned there that Trump basically, it's almost like people reference he kind of threw a hand grenade into the system here. It certainly upset the apple cart for sure, especially the establishment and cheerleaders of the establishment. Do you think some of the reasons that the Trump-Russia collusion narrative was where it originated, do you think it has to do with the establishment hate for him, the neocon hate from him? Is it a lot of the same people and sides of this equation that are pushing that kind of Trump-Russia stuff?
Oh, totally. So not only, is there some truth in the idea of a deep state, but there's also an equivalent to the deep state in terms of the political establishment that's even outside of government, right? So the elite in both political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, not so much perhaps in the Libertarians, but because the Libertarians aren't in office yet, but certainly among Republicans and Democrats, there is a certain shared consensus about, foreign policy. Not that they always emphasize exactly the same conflicts, exactly the same way of going about conducting wars, but in general, you find that there is a rather broad consensus among them about things like the Iraq War, which, of course, Joe Biden voted for, as well as Hillary Clinton, as well as, George W. Bush leading us into. Things like the Libyan intervention, you saw that neoconservatives and various hawkish Republicans like John McCain were favorable towards that. So there really is this sort of bipartisan elite consensus in support of a hawkish foreign policy and in support of kind of administrative control over our lives and over the economy. And again, you've got some differences within this consensus, but the consensus comes together and opposes anyone from the outside, like Donald Trump or like, the Libertarian Party, like Ron Paul, for example, anyone who wants to challenge the consensus point of view on foreign policy or on the power, the administrative power of government.
Yeah, you said, well, not the Libertarian Party yet because they don't have power. I don't know if you saw this, but the current chair of the LP is not well loved by a lot of people in my circles for sure, and probably a lot of the libertarians that you chat with online. But he actually officially invited John Bolton to join the Libertarian Party, because now all of a sudden Bolton's the hero to the people that I think kind of cozy up to neocons and basically to the left. What do you see coming of this John Bolton worship by the left and the media and all this? Will this just die out like everything else does and on to something next week?
Well, John Bolton is really the perfect symbol of what we've been talking about here. This is a guy who was, up to his mustache, so to speak, in supporting the Iraq War and in, generally supporting the most hardline possible against Iran and against any number of other countries. And he would actually get us into, I think, President Trump said, 6 different wars if he were, given the chance. So John Bolton is as much of a sort of crazed warmonger as anyone possibly can be within our political system. And yet it turns out that all these Democrats, many of whom often pretend to be supporters of peace, are willing to support John Bolton to the max if they think it's going to embarrass Donald Trump. And they really consider John Bolton to be part of their club. He's someone who they're happy to feature on their op-ed pages or to invite on the television. And apparently now, we've got a guy in the LP who's willing to have Bolton, who's going to give Bolton a forum there as well. I have to say, I'm not totally surprised to have someone in the Libertarian Party doing that because, it is a party that welcomed someone like William Weld as its vice presidential nominee just 4 years ago. And William Weld, while he's not exactly a neocon, he certainly is a Rockefeller Republican statist and, had always been pro-war as well as pro-gun control up until the moment he decided to become a libertarian.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, the person I was referencing was quite accepting, not only accepting, I guess we'll say, quite inviting to Bill Weld and John Bolton. And I think it's Tom Woods that has said, I don't know that the chairman is a CIA asset, but if he were to be one, wouldn't act much different. But that's a whole nother podcast to have. I've heard people push back against the idea that Bolton is actually a neocon himself. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it depends on how you're using the term. To the extent that neoconservatism means ultra hawkishness, then John Bolton certainly fits the mold. To the extent that neoconservatism today is a certain network of people, John Bolton has connections to AEI and connections to all of these other institutions which have, at least in the recent past, been very neoconservative. He was, a regular, his byline appeared very often in the Weekly Standard. So all of his associations are with neocons. His foreign policy views are pretty much identical to the neocons. The difference between John Bolton and the neocons is that Bolton doesn't seem to have had the kind of left-wing background that many of the old classic neocons used to have. So John Bolton, was never a Trotskyist as far as I can tell. He also is a bit more of a, in some ways a cynic with regard to his hawkish foreign policy. He's not quite as much of an idealist. He doesn't talk about, the value of democracy as much as some of the other neocons do. Many of the neocons, will claim to be very idealistic and say that, well, we just want to defeat tyrannies in other countries so that their people can have liberty and democracy. And John Bolton will present himself as being, a bit less motivated by those kinds of idealist claims and a bit more on the side of, well, no, they just pose a threat to us, and so we have to take a hard line against them. But I think those are all kind of minor differences between other neocons.
Yes, agreed. Trump ran on a fairly non-interventionist foreign policy, and it was such a shock, to me at least, that he got in at all. And then he surrounds himself with a few good people here and there, and I thought, well, maybe we have got a shot here at pulling back the troop number overseas. And then he does get someone like John Bolton in his cabinet. Did it seem like his movement got infiltrated somehow? Like when Bannon gets pushed out and some of the more populist voices around him get pushed out? What happened there?
Well, he came into power and, even Donald Trump himself might not have totally expected to win. So he came in and he didn't have a pre-existing political bench of talent that he could draw upon personally. And he didn't even necessarily have much of a, connection to longstanding institutional sort of paleo-conservatives or old guard conservatives or other types. And in fact, they have very few institutions at all. So even if he knew what they were, he wouldn't have, had that many people to draw upon. So basically, Donald Trump came into office and he didn't have a Rolodex full of people ready to call and put into power. put into places in his administration. Whereas the neocons always have a full Rolodex, and the Republican Party establishment always has a full Rolodex. And so you saw at the beginning of the Trump administration, Donald Trump would try to appoint people who seemingly came out of nowhere, people like Rex Tillerson, for example, at the State Department. And he was experimenting. He was really trying to find some things that were not just the regular sort of establishment Republicans and neocons. And what happened is that the establishment Republicans and the neocons, they kept wearing away at him. They kept saying, well, okay, you've lost this guy or this guy didn't work out. Therefore, here we have this perfect candidate. Look at his resume. Look at all of his experience. You're going to be the one setting the policy, Mr. President. This guy will just be implementing them for you. And I think Donald Trump, sort of gave these people a chance, including, of course, John Bolton. And, Donald Trump isn't someone who's been, listening to podcasts and reading all of our magazines and following the ins and outs of why John Bolton was a terrible guy. So I don't think he was fully aware of just how awful and just how opposed to him someone like John Bolton would be. And now, of course, he knows that very, very well.
Yeah, it came back to bite him, as I suspected it would at some point. I have a love, basically, for the paleo-conservatives and the paleo-libertarian movement and the anti-war right, like Murray Rothbard used to call it, the old right. Has Trump, in your mind, tapped into that spirit? Is he some kind of modern reincarnation of any part of that to you?
He is. I think Murray Rothbard, for example, would have a very interesting analysis of Donald Trump's success. Rothbard was kind of the pioneer in thinking about libertarian populism and the idea that, if you had a libertarianism that was culturally somewhat right of center, that would have the best opportunity for actually electing people and actually starting to change things in this country. And Ron Paul kind of indicated that was true with his success, in the 2000s. And I think what Rothbard would say about Donald Trump is, at a time when other libertarians seem to generally abandon populism, Donald Trump, who was not a libertarian, picked up the banner of populism, and as a result, he stormed the Republican Party, and then he wound up getting elected as president. So certainly half of the libertarian populist agenda, or at least the libertarian populist approach, was vindicated by Donald Trump's success in his election. So I think Rothbard would actually be a little bit, feel a little bit vindicated in some ways, even though Trump is not a libertarian. He nonetheless shows that there is a lot of truth to what Murray Rothbard was saying. And I think Rothbard would also say that, Donald Trump, in, sort of providing pushback and friction against the deep state, against the foreign policy establishment, and against the administrative bureaucracy, all those things are actually sort of libertarian in an effective, real way. That is more significant than just whatever the president wants to say, or more significant than some of his deviations from what Rothbard would like to see, perhaps in trade policy.
You wrote an excellent piece also on Justin Amash, and you kind of mentioned him in the article we're discussing on Neocons Come Home to Roost. I'd like to get your thoughts on Mr. Amash.
Well, I had always liked Justin Amash, but there were warning signs from the time he was first elected that I tried to overlook and ignore, including the fact that, he made a really strong point of pointing out certain libertarian factions when he was first elected and saying that he identified with basically the more respectable and middle-of-the-road faction, the more Hayekian rather than sort of Misesian or Rothbardian side of libertarianism. Now, there's nothing wrong with being a Hayekian necessarily, but the way in which Amash kind of went out of his way to make that point made me think, at the time, that it felt just a little strange. And in retrospect, I now see that he's a guy who kind of wants approval from certain mainstream areas of opinion, including, I think, a lot of the sort of mainstream of Democrats and perhaps even neoconservatives. And Justin Amash's very sudden decision to withdraw from the Libertarian Party nomination contest seems to me not to have been motivated by any danger that he would have failed to get the nomination. Because and I think almost anyone would say that he would have been a much stronger candidate than Jo Jorgensen, and would almost certainly have overcome her and all the other competitors in the nominating process. No, I think instead what happened is that Amash expected to be hailed as a hero by Democrats, maybe, and certainly by neocons and anti-Trump, never Trump Republican types. They thought he would be a hero if he was running for president and was going to take votes away from Donald Trump. But the early polls actually tended to show that to the extent that a Amash candidacy as a libertarian took votes away from anyone, it might well have subtracted votes from Joe Biden. And in Michigan, where Justin Amash is a congressman, even a few votes subtracted from Joe Biden might make the difference between Biden winning the state and losing it. So I think Justin Amash came under overwhelming pressure from Democrats and from neocons and from never-Trumpers to not run as a libertarian and not run the risk of costing Joe Biden the state of Michigan.
Yeah, well put. That's a very interesting perspective on it. I'm so, I guess, in a libertarian bubble, so to speak, that I thought, well, boy, he sure got a lot of hate and pushback from all these hardcore LP types, the real ones, not the neocon loving ones. But yeah, your perspective makes a lot more sense. It's a better thought of it in the macro sense. Let me ask you about, we mentioned this earlier, Paul Gottfried's written a lot about neocons attempting to purge legitimate conservative voices from the right over the years. In your career at the American Conservative and at Modern Age, have you personally witnessed some of this kind of struggle from within with neocon forces trying to drive out legitimate voices?
Well, I've always been outside of the kind of institutional framework where the neocons could come after me. But I certainly have seen, for example, people that I've published in the American Conservative and elsewhere, that people come under pressure from the neocons. Sometimes they lose their jobs as a result of opposing the neocons. And so, especially during the Bush years, free speech was the last thing that the conservative movement believed in at that time. And there really was, a purge or suppression, or at least, a kind of self-censorship that came into effect with anyone who had doubts about George W. Bush's agenda. And George W. Bush's agenda, of course, was not only the disastrous Iraq War and a lot of other foreign policy hawkishness, but also, his No Child Left Behind, his Medicare Part D. I mean, George W. Bush was doing all kinds of things that were contrary to what conservatives believed in, and yet virtually no criticism of him was permitted.
Had Hillary won in 2016, what would be the difference with United States foreign policy and where we are now with it?
Well, I think it would be much more hawkish. Donald Trump really upset a lot of the establishment when, he's attempted diplomacy with Kim Jong-un in North Korea. You can see that even now there is continuing pressure from the usual sort of think tanks and pundits for the U.S. to get deeply involved into Syria. And of course, we were always involved to some extent in Syria. We were, providing arms to the supposedly moderate Islamists. We, had, a few advisors here and there. I think that would have gotten much, much worse with Hillary Clinton as president. I think she would have had something to prove, and she's always been a fairly hawkish politician. She, of course, was a supporter of the Iraq War back in 2003. She was one of the more hawkish voices within the Obama administration. Joe Biden was actually less hawkish than Hillary Clinton was. So I think Hillary Clinton would have gotten us into wars. Maybe we would do more stuff in Libya. Maybe we'd be doing, reinforcing our position in Iraq or something like that. But I think there's a very good chance we would get into Syria in a big way.
Yeah, as an anti-war person, and basically since 2000-ish, it was interesting being in, I don't know, now I almost feel embarrassed saying protests because they were quite different, but this anti-war sentiment was big in the LP, and it was easy to have Democratic friends saying, yeah, right on, I'm with you. And as soon as 2008 hit, they became silent. And now at this point, I'm almost, I'm reluctant to say that they were ever anti-war. Do you see the modern left as anti-war at all? Or is it more just we hate who's in office if we oppose them? And if they happen to be for war, then we're against war?
Well, in retrospect, we can certainly see that most of the protests and most of the criticism in left-wing magazines that were directed against George W. Bush and his foreign policy, most of that was just partisan. Most of it was, only because a Republican was in office. And we kind of should have known that that was going to be the case, because you didn't really see much anti-war activity on the left when Bill Clinton was president. And Bill Clinton, of course, he had meddling in the Balkans. He had, bombings of Iraq and of the Sudan and elsewhere. And there was very little of a left-wing criticism or resistance movement against Bill Clinton doing those things. When George W. Bush got into office, actually, there was that time, of course, between 9/11 and about 2005, when a lot of, most of the mainstream left, most of the Democratic Party, was actually very favorably disposed towards George W. Bush's foreign policy. And even though there were left-wing protesters in the streets, a lot of them were, kind of the typical left-wing crazies who, think that every Republican is a fascist. They were not necessarily people who had, sort of firm anti-war principles. And as you said, they vanished as soon as Barack Obama became president. Now, that said, there are some people on the left, there are organizations and individuals who really do have firm anti-war principles. I think, one criticism I have of the left, whether it's the people who are less firm or the people who are more firm, is that they do tend to believe in a kind of a one world system. And they believe in things like the International Criminal Court and the United Nations and so forth. So even sometimes when they are anti-war, they nonetheless are globalists in ways that I think are quite, sort of dangerous. And so it seems to me that really the best chance for a restrained, realistic, generally anti-war foreign policy, it's going to come from the right.
Yeah, well put. I've thought that same thing for quite some time. Where do you see the conservative movement headed in the age of Trump? Does it kind of matter? Does it hinge on if he wins in November? What's your kind of take on the conservative movement as a whole? Even if you want to say conservative Inc. versus, say, the real conservatism.
Well, I think, it's surprising. Partly there is a generational change. There are a lot of young conservatives who grew up in the George W. Bush years, and they're acutely aware of George W. Bush's failures, and they do not want to repeat them. And they also, these are millennials and younger people who don't really have a memory of Ronald Reagan. And so conservatism for them is something they've had to think about and discover for themselves. And that, I think, has made them less susceptible to manipulation by the neoconservatives than a lot of older conservatives had been. So even if Donald Trump had not been elected in 2016, I think you would have seen a lot of questioning of neoconservative dogmas and a little bit of sort of new thinking and ferment within the right. Now, that said, I do think that if Donald Trump loses this November, a lot of neocons are going to pop out of the woodwork and say, see, I told you so. And a lot of conservative institutions, which have been kind of slowly and gradually turning from neoconservatism back to some sort of more traditional conservatism, a lot of those institutions are probably going to say suddenly, oh, I guess, now we can jettison all of our, sort of Trumpian points of view and go back to being much closer to the neocons. So if Trump loses, I think you'll actually see a lot of bloodletting on the right, a lot of, purging, a lot of attempts to, demonize anyone who supported Trump, and a lot of fair weather Trump supporters are going to turn around and go right back to being George W. Bush and John McCain style Republicans or, kind of phony conservatives.
Now, if he wins, is there an opportunity to push some of those people out, almost purge the neocons?
It's starting to happen. And you know what? The Trump administration itself, we had talked about earlier how they didn't have a Rolodex, and the neocons did, and the establishment Republicans did. But, in recent weeks and recent months, you've actually seen some interesting changes within the Trump administration. And they do seem to be starting to fire people who were going to be disloyal and were going to be neocons, people who are lower level than John Bolton was, but who nonetheless had the ability to work mischief. So I think a second Trump administration would actually have much better personnel than the first Trump administration has had. And within the conservative movement as a whole, I think you generally would see a lot of accelerated generational change, where basically a lot of people who had made their careers by doing what the neocons wanted them to do are going to look like yesterday's news, and they're going to early retire. And instead, you're going to have new conservatives and young people with fresh ideas rise into the ranks and sort of start to take power. So I think there would be a much healthier conservative movement if Donald Trump was reelected, and if you see some continuing change on the right, rather than an attempt to salvage an already decrepit neoconservatism if Trump loses.
What role do you think Tucker Carlson plays in all of this, as far as his voice being so popular and so fairly unique in mainstream media right now?
Tucker Carlson is the MVP of, the sort of old guard conservative and you might call it Trumpian conservative movement. Tucker Carlson, in his own way, is as valuable as President Trump himself. And certainly Tucker Carlson has kind of an articulation and an intellectual appreciation for where his ideas are coming from that is unique. And so Tucker Carlson is irreplaceable. And as a result, you see all of these attacks on him, mostly coming from the left, but there are some neocons who would like to kind of get in on that action as well. And you see this enormous pressure being brought to bear on Tucker Carlson's advertisers trying to, force them to stop advertising on his television program and try to, force them off the air. And I think it's just the fact that they are trying that hard against Tucker Carlson shows you that this is our MVP. This is a guy who actually is winning battles. He's winning hearts and minds, and they're terrified of him, and they will do anything they can to shut him up.
Yeah, well put. It's crazy to have a show as popular as his, yet you still have what some call the cathedral operatives trying to shut it down and pulling advertising. I guess I got to bring this back around to libertarianism because that's what this show is typically about. I just love talking neocons and paleoconservatives and stuff. If you could paint the perfect picture of where libertarianism fits in to conservatism moving forward, the best way to align with certain sides and whatnot, what would you say?
Well, libertarianism is valuable for its general skepticism about power, its general skepticism about the motives of government officials, and its willingness to take a careful look in terms of economics and in terms of kind of the perverse incentives that exist for government to keep growing whether or not it achieves anything. All of those things are very valuable. They're lessons that a lot of conservatives need to continually not only learn, but keep relearning. And it seems to me that, libertarians and conservatives can work together quite happily. And even some of the disagreements are kind of opportunities to learn and grow with both sides. What I think becomes dangerous and counterproductive is when libertarians get taken over by the cultural left. And unfortunately, we see a lot of libertarians drifting that way right now. And, and sometimes I think libertarians are a little too dogmatic about certain policies like trade, for example. Even if they object to the kind of trade policy that Donald Trump has been leading, I think they should keep it in perspective that there's a limit to what, tariffs can do, and that in some cases, there are much bigger fights that libertarians could be invested in where they could actually succeed more than, just complaining about Donald Trump's economic nationalism.
Extremely well put. Before we go, can you tell my listeners about Modern Age and what you do over there?
Yes, Modern Age is a conservative quarterly publication. It was founded back in 1957 by Russell Kirk, who was the author of The Conservative Mind a few years before that in 1953. And Modern Age brings together sort of the brightest minds on the American right, including many of the best libertarians. And it sort of looks deeply at the theory, the history, and the future of conservatism, libertarianism, America, and the sorts of values that we care about. And so it's, I hope, an intellectually lively publication. It's something I'm very honored to edit. And I encourage everyone to check it out. The website is modernagejournal.com. And the Twitter handle is modagejournal.
Excellent. I will link to all of that in the show notes page for this episode. Daniel McCarthy, thank you so much for joining us here on Death to Tyrants.
I was honored to be here. Thank you.
All right. I hope you guys enjoyed that chat with Daniel McCarthy. I'm stoked I finally got to have him on, and I love chatting about those topics. So there's going to be some really cool things coming out of the Death to Tyrants world. I've got a Patreon, and it's patreon.com/Death to Tyrants. Duh. Well, when you are a Patreon contributor, for a while, you've just been able to help me out. And every penny I get on there goes right back into the show. Well, now it's time for me to give back to you guys. There's going to start to be a recording. I'm not sure how often I'm going to do it. Maybe a couple of times a month, I'm going to put together a special podcast exclusively for people that are Patreon donors. And I don't want to give too many surprises away yet, but we have some really cool ideas in mind, and that is coming soon. That's coming down the road very soon. Again, you can sign up over at patreon.com/Death to Tyrants. Let's see. Follow me on Twitter at BuckRebel, BuckRebel. Of course, find me on Facebook, facebook.com/Death to Tyrants podcast. And if you guys are going to join the Libertarian Party, I've got a link. You can do that at www.lp.org/Death to Tyrants. Geez, is that all the housekeeping I've got this week? I think so. Once again, welcome to all of the new listeners. Thank you guys so much for being here. And I got a bonus episode coming out this week. Watch for that soon. See ya.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquids, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Death to Tyrants podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.